Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Kengor, and I'm the author of the Emmaus Road Publishing book, Emmaus Road Publishing through the St. Paul Center, The Worst of Indignities, the Catholic Church on Slavery. And that phrase, the worst of indignities, that was a phrase that was used by Pope Pius X. And he referred to slavery as the worst of indignities, and he also referred to it as an instrument of Satan. In fact, that was also a phrase that Pope Paul III used in his encyclical from 1537, Sublimus Deus. And in fact, in that encyclical, Paul III, and keep in mind here, 1537. So that's 300 years before the Brits and Wilberforce ended slavery. That is, and the Brits and Wilberforce ended slavery 30 years before America did with the Civil War. So here was the Catholic Church, 1537, condemning slavery. And as I point out in the book, we have formal papal exhortations, bulls, encyclicals going back to 1434, 1435. So that would be 400 years before Wilberforce and the Brits ended slavery. We have statements from church councils like the Council of Agda in the year 506 condemning slavery. We have condemnations from popes like Gregory the Great in the late 500s who set free 2 slaves. We have saints in the church like Saint Patrick around the year 400 AD who himself had been a slave. Yes, Saint Patrick had been a slave. So the church's experience with slavery and condemning it goes way back. But I wanted to talk today, in the last episode we did, we talked about the guy on the cover of the book, St. Peter Claver, in honor of his feast day on September 9th. But I wanted today to talk about one of my favorites, and I suggested at one point maybe putting her face on the cover as well, and that's St. Josephine Bakhita, who was born in the Sudan in 1869. And what happened to this poor young girl from the Sudan it's just criminal. It's heartbreaking. And I would say that of all the chapters that I wrote in the book, that was the hardest to write. I mean, that was really, it was just anguish going through, reading the accounts of her life, what she had to endure, what she went through. Well, I'll start here just by quoting you a little bit from my book. I won't read it word for word here. But I start the chapter with this. Picture 2 happy, innocent girls in a large green meadow. They go there often, they run, they chase, they play, they pick flowers, and they eat herbs. They laugh. It's a good life. This appears another lovely day for them, but it soon becomes horribly ugly, utterly unforgettable for the misery to follow. We stop playing for a while, the 9-year-old later remembers, and were intent on picking tasty herbs. All of a sudden, they encounter 2 strange men, armed men who creep out from behind a hedge. One of the men asks the younger child to help him find a parcel that he says he misplaced in a nearby thicket. And this is so sick. This is frankly the kind of modern human trafficking that still goes on to this day, right? I mean, this is 150 years ago, but this hasn't gone away. One of the men asks the younger child to help him find a parcel that he says he misplaced in a nearby thicket. He points in the direction. She goes and looks, walking deeper into the woods. Her friend is gone. The 9-year-old girl later recalls, I was too simple to understand their tricks. Suddenly, the 2 men seize her, no longer speaking kindly. The one man pulls a large dagger from his belt. He tells her that if she makes a noise, he will kill her on the spot. Quick, he orders, follow us. His accomplice shoves a gun barrel into the thin back of the little girl. Terrified, trembling all over, I hate reading this, it's so sad. Too frightened to speak, the youngster does as she is told. I was stunned with terror, she later remembers painfully. I tried to scream. A lump in my throat made me dumb. I could neither speak nor cry out. They pushed me on violently into the thick of the woods. The men force the innocent child to walk into the evening and through the night until she is exhausted. Her shins and bare feet are bleeding from the sharp stones and brambles along the way. She sobs, but her captors have no pity and no mercy. This is a 9-year-old little girl, man. But monsters, right? Monsters. All I could think of was my family, recalls the girl. And by the way, how this transcends race, these are Black Muslim African Sudanese captors capturing a Black Sudanese slave girl. I mean, people of all races have engaged in this kind of brutality to one another. This goes beyond race. Read the Old Testament. Jews in captivity to the Egyptians, to the Mesopotamia. The girl recalled later, all I could think of was my family. I kept calling out for my mother and my father with an anguish in my heart that was hard to put into words. My captors threatened me if I wasn't quiet. They reach the house of one of the men, who drags her inside and shoves her into a hole of a room strewn with tools and scraps. There's no bed or blanket, only a bare floor. They drag her in there, leave her in the middle of the floor. He chucks a piece of bread at her as if she were a dog, though a dog would have gotten better treatment. He locks the door. She will be confined there for the next 30 days. I still feel the anguish of those hours, the 9-year-old little girl later vividly relates over 30 years later. Worn out with crying, I would collapse and lie on the ground in a kind of stupor. It seemed to tear my heart to pieces. She visualizes her parents and siblings and moaned and groaned for them, but to no avail. She would never see them again. What shall we call this pretty girl? Asked the one man menacingly. Bakhita, answers the other. Let us call her Bakhita. It is a word that in Arabic means the lucky one. The unlucky child is told by her Arab kidnappers, remember, from today on, your name is Bakhita. Forget what they called you at home. And in fact, she would indeed come to forget the name her parents gave her at birth. So that's the lead to my chapter, and I also cite the sources from which this came, and the different biographies of Bakhita. But she eventually took the name Josephine Margaret Bakhita, and what she went through was just hell at so many levels. I next go through, her long journey, how far she had to walk, how she was eventually taken captive. She was sold to a Muslim slave owner. It is Muslims who have engaged in this kind of savage slavery for 1,500 years. Okay, ISIS still does it to this day. The last countries to abolish slavery, the latest to abolish slavery into the late 1900s, were Muslim countries. I quote in the book one Muslim sultan who's perplexed at this kind of Western Christian attitude by popes and Protestant abolitionists to abolish slavery. He's like, I don't understand. You invade a country, you conquer it, you pillage it, you take captives, you take the women as slaves, you create your harem. The boys become janissaries, forced to convert to Islam, to fight Christians later. I don't understand all this moral hand-wringing. I don't get this, right? Muhammad was a warlord who owned slaves, slave girls. So and that's what happened to Bakhita. So she was taken by a Muslim general in a Sudanese town of El Obeid, Obeid, and he owned a number of slaves, all young and healthy. Bakhita and another young slave girl were given as maids to his 2 daughters. And at first they were treated largely well, and then poor Bakhita made a little mistake, whatever that might be, that enraged the vicious son of the slave master. So the son grabbed a lash, beat her severely, whipped her incessantly while she laid on the floor, finished her off with a kick to the side, leaving her laying there as if she felt half dead. Bakhita said later, "Some slaves must have carried me away and laid me down on a straw mat, completely unconscious. There I remained for more than a month." This little girl had these literal month-long periods in her life. Thrown on the floor after she was first caught, left there for a month. Here, laying there for a month, half dead. On and on, and incapacitated for weeks. Injured and maimed, she was eventually dealt away to another Arab owner, a Turkish general in the Sudanese town of Kordofan. And here she was beaten daily, where she was treated with terrible cruelty by this general's mother and his sadistic wife. She and another girl served as the mistresses, who they would dress, perfume, fan, and as she said, "Woe to us accidentally if we made a mistake and hurt them. The whip would be on us without mercy. I can say in all truth," wrote Bakhita later, "that in the 3 years I spent in their service, there was not even one day when I was not dealt some punishment or other. Not one day, not one day. When a wound from the whip began to heal, other blows would pour down on me." The general's wife was so exacting, I would say insane, diabolical, devilish, from the pit of hell, that she would wake up at 6 a.m. every morning, the rise time of the slaves, many of which had been in service late into the night, just to make sure that none of them slept in. If any of the slaves dared not be perfectly punctual at 6 in the morning, she immediately had them whipped. If the slaves got sick, they were not deemed worthy of medical attention. When a slave died, the corpse was simply tossed out into the field or dung heap like rubbish or compost. She was so unkind. Here is, I could just give example after example, probably have you crying, of Bakhita laying there on the floor. I'll give one more if I can get through it. The worst torture, the sadistic wife liked to have her slaves tattooed in her honor. This isn't the kind of tattoos that people are getting today in tattoo shops. These were not your typical tattoos. They were carvings of the flesh, which were done by another sadistic woman who had a specialty in this cruel craft. Where do you find people like this? Where do you find people like this? Where are they that would treat other people like this? This warped woman was skilled in the ghoulish art of carving up the slaves as they screamed in agony, while the mistress stood behind them, whip in hand, if they squirmed at all. Here's Bakhita writing about the process. The woman had next to her a dish of white flour, another of salt, and a razor. She ordered the first of us to lie on the ground, while two of the strongest slaves held her, the slave, by her hands and her feet. Then, bending over the poor girl, the torturer began to trace on her belly strange patterns with the white flour, about 60 in all. When she had done with the patterns, the woman took the razor and began to make incisions along these, while the wretched victim moaned and bled profusely. I stood transfixed, scared to death, as I observed what was going on, all the time painfully aware that my turn would soon come. Nor was that the end of the painful operation. Salt was rubbed into the wounds so that the gaping hedges of the scars would show off permanently the patterns. It was a cruel torture. The poor wretch was trembling all over, and so was I, as I awaited my turn. And indeed, when the first victim was carried away unconscious, it was my turn to lie down and take her place. I'm sorry that I'm reading this to you folks, but I feel the need to, because I think people need to know what these people went through. It's one thing to talk about slavery, and of course it sounds bad, but this is what it was like for some people. By the way, well, let me add, I also profile in the book two American slaves, Pierre Toussaint, and Pierre Toussaint was really, I think, another saintly figure. In fact, he's on his way to potential canonization. He's now the Venerable Pierre Toussaint, and also the Venerable Augustus Tolton, who became arguably the first Black priest in America. They weren't treated this cruelly. So not all slaves went through what Bakhita went through. She went through a special hell on earth. So Bakhita said, I had no strength to move, but a look at the lady sitting behind her with the lash at the ready to strike made me quickly lie down on the floor. Fortunately, my face was spared, but 6 intricate patterns were designed on my breast and 60 more, as was customary, on my belly, and 48 on the right arm. It is hard to express in words what I felt. I thought I would die, especially when salt was rubbed into the wounds. Picture the 2 women doing this, doing the tattooing with the mistress behind them with the whip. This ghoul. Literally bathed in blood, I was carried away and placed on my straw mat, where I was to remain for several hours, totally unaware of what was going on about me. When I came around, I saw next to me my 2 poor friends who had shared the same ordeal. For more than a month, again, we were condemned to lie down, unable to move, without so much as a cloth to dry the serum, oozing from our open wounds. The scars are still evident on my body. That's Bakhita's account. How many scars? So Bakhita here acknowledged 6 on the breast, 60 on the belly, 48 on the right arm. There was a total of 114 done to the sadistic satisfaction of her vicious mistress. And of course, these carvings were in addition to the countless scars she had from daily whippings and other beatings. Just horrific. She was eventually saved from this by an Italian merchant who came into, I mean, a lot happened after this, but this kind Italian merchant came to town and saw her serving as a slave and took a special affection toward her, a special liking, and it was wholesome. Didn't see her as like a potential sex slave or anything like that, and bought her. Process, really complicated process of Bakhita going to another slave owner. There's a really good Italian movie on this. That way, I think the Italian movie is not accurate. I mean, they show her being whipped brutally by, I think, one of the Italian owners. That didn't happen with the Italian owners. One of the Italian owners, the family loved her so much, and especially the beautiful relationship between Bakhita and their daughter, that they didn't want to let her go. and she loved the family too. But through a process of meeting nuns, meeting priests, going to the local church, going to the local convent, and the Italians ending slavery, the local bishop, cardinal getting involved, local priests, local nuns getting involved, they eventually set her free and won her freedom. And Bakhita eventually became, in Italy, a nun herself, and became really like a local celebrity in this local convent. By the way, much like I mentioned Pierre Toussaint, Augustus Tolton, Pierre Toussaint, when he was freed in New York, he was a hairdresser. In fact, the family that he worked for, I'll talk about Pierre Toussaint and Augustus Tolton in a future episode. They eventually became embraced and celebrated by the whites in the community, who really came to love them for who they were as human beings, right? Made in the image of God, the Imago Dei. So Josephine Bakhita eventually served in this convent to the local people of Italy and was just widely beloved. Died in 1947. She was born in 1869, died in 1947. So here was a modern ex-slave who eventually became a saint, and she was canonized by Pope John Paul II, and who made a statement in Sudan about Sudan will now have a saint, an ex-slave. And you can find online, Google, I talk about it in this book, Google U.S. State Department report on modern slavery in the Sudan. It's been going on in the Sudan and in parts of northern Africa into the 2000s, with black Muslim slavers still capturing little girls like Bakhita to this day. So it hasn't ended. But Josephine Bakhita, her story is heartbreaking, but it's also very inspiring when you see what she persevered, what she overcame. And by the end of her life, she was this happy person who was amazingly grateful that in the end, she ended up in a place where she could serve Christ and the church and become what she became. But man, I'll tell you, for her to have that kind of heroic virtue, I think I could do it. I think I would spend the rest of my life bitter and hateful. But it was through the redemption and the saving power of Christ and her church that she came to that view. So there you go, Saint Josephine Bakhita, in the book, The Worst of Indignities. I'm Paul Kengor, and thanks for listening to me again, and I'll talk to you again later. Saint Josephine Bakhita, pray for us. Amen.